Hello, it's Lromanosky from Calgary, Canada, and I'm shooting from the Lug Nuts facility, and we always have some interesting cars that we're working on. 61 Rover, beautiful E320 cab. We've got a Spiker C8 in the corner there. But what I wanted to shoot a video on today was this C4 Corvette, 1988. That is in exceptionally well-preserved condition, and so I wouldn't say I'm definitely not a Corvette expert or even a Corvette guy, but I did a little bit of research into the car, and of course I do remember these. I'm old enough to remember, you know, this coming out to a lot of fanfare. So I will do an in-depth video on the car. We'll start about, you know, talking a brief history on the Corvette C4 and some of the things I learned just by scanning my old road and track magazines and so forth. And then about the history of this particular car, which has only gone 35,000 kilometers and has had a single lady owner, and kind of a fun story. So I'll go through that. We'll do a walk around video of the exterior of the car and the interior. And then we'll go underneath the car. We used our fancy cryo blaster machine, and we really cleaned up nice underneath. It's quite, I mean, the thing looks brand new. And then we're planning on putting this on Bring a Trailer, and so this will be a preview video on the car, and we'll follow that up with a driving video. Okay, so you know, we'll do a presentation that is extremely thorough, as is my custom here for Lawrence's Garage, and hopefully you'll remain interested for the duration. Please like and subscribe, and we'll turn the camera around and get into this C4 Corvette in a little bit more detail. So there are better sources of information on the history of Corvette than myself. But just to summarize it briefly, the Corvette came out in 1953. It had something called a blue flame engine, 2-speed gearbox, not particularly sporty. And then it evolved into, in some cases, a real fire-breathing monster with a lot of help from a guy named Zora Arkus Duntov, of course. Okay, so we have, you know, perhaps the glory days of the Corvette in the 60s. We have the Mako Shark car that comes out in the later 60s, and then the Stingray. So that's the C3, and it soldiers on from 1968 all the way to 1982. It goes through the, you know, painful emissions, strangulation, safety regulations, and so on, and it's kind of a pale shadow of what it was, overblown, and, well, I mean, many people think a little bit tacky. And then General Motors, you know, the market share is in a bit of a slide. I mean, General Motors had over 50% of the North American market or US market in, I think, 1962. And this is, you know, halved to, you know, maybe 30%. And it's currently only, I think, you know, 16 or 17. So in the 80s, there was a big push to, you know, come up with some brand values and decide what Chevrolet was about, and then focus the new products, you know, relating to those values, and certainly, you know, affordability, usability, practicality, and so on were high on the list. But there was also a movement to show off some of the engineering expertise within the company and the styling expertise. So they had you know, a real first-class team that was put on the new Corvette, and they wanted to get rid of the flashiness, the you know, the kind of the over-the-top styling. A lot of, you know, the C3 had a lot of non-functional elements on it. So this was an engineering first car where the shape of the body was determined by aerodynamics, and there weren't a lot of superfluous add-ons and so on. It was meant to be like a world car, the world's best sports car, to show what the US could do, what Chevrolet could do. And it had a whole bunch of new technology, production, in terms of the way it was produced and the materials that it was produced. So it came out. They started making these in early 1983, but it was a 1984 model year, so they skipped the 1983 model year. And the C4 came out to much fanfare. The magazine started reporting on it in early 1983. So it's a glass fiber reinforced plastic body on a steel frame with heavy use of aluminum, which is fairly unusual at the time. We didn't really see a lot of aluminum in the 1980s. Maybe it wasn't until the NSX came out in 1990 that we saw our first aluminum car. But this car, the wishbones are forged aluminum. There's the hub carriers are aluminum. There's a lot of, and we can see that if in underneath, and you can that section of the video is indexed. But underneath the car, there are a lot of aluminum pieces, and there wouldn't have been in the period, Ferrari 308 or Porsche 911. Those are all steel. I think the Ferrari might have had, the aluminum trunk lid and bonnet lid, but everything else was steel suspension and so on. The 80s Jaguars were all steel. There wasn't a lot. Aluminum was not in widespread use, even in the exotics in the 80s. The car had a transverse composite spring that was also kind of unusual, and it all added up to a car that was 3,300 pounds, which was light, and wide track, big tires. Goodyear specially developed the Gatorback 16-inch tires when it came out. The engine was a carryover, a carryover with crossfire injection. It only had 205 horsepower for the 1984 model year, but then it gained tuned port injection, which this car has. This is an 88, and it gained aluminum heads along the way. So the horsepower of this car is 245 horsepower and around 300 pound-feet of torque, which was pretty competitive. In that era, there was the Porsche 928, a 944 turbo, and those would have been in the 225 to 250 horsepower range. There was the Jag that had 260 horsepower to 5.3 liters. In the mid 80s, you couldn't even buy a Porsche 930 turbo in America. That was reintroduced in 1986 with 282 horsepower. Okay, so the power to weight was very competitive, and the performance was, I think, 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds, and pushing 160 miles an hour. So that was class-leading performance at the time, and with a price, and this is a Corvette tradition, that was considerably lower than the Porsches and Ferraris and so on that it was compared to. Okay, this was reviewed extremely positively. The Road and Track article says that the design center of the world had moved from Turin to Detroit, and this was superior to anything that Europe was producing at the time, and there was a great amount of really positive publicity and fanfare that went into this car, and it was reviewed very highly. Some of the criticisms were that the optional Z51 suspension was harsh, and that it was a little bit hard to get in and out of. But other than that, it was really a sensational introduction. I did pull. Let me just get this over here. from my road and track collection. This spread, which I'll show you, which I thought was kind of interesting. This was a poster that Road and Track had in the magazine. Corvettes from 53 to 84, and there's a whole bunch of Corvettes in here that I haven't even seen before. Crazy experimental cars. Okay, so, and you didn't get pullouts like this regularly in Road and Track. So this was kind of a big deal. And like I said, the reviews were quite over the top, and this shows the lineage there. Okay. Anyway, I thought that was kind of fun. Okay, so this was ordered directly from GM, from an employee. The only owner the cars had was a woman who worked for GM, and she was a fairly senior purchasing agent. And she told me that she bought everything from hotel rooms for the executives to Learjets to, you know, office supplies and everything else. So she was employed with GM. She placed the order, and it was delivered through GSL Chev City, which is on Boat Trail in Calgary. She ordered every option, or she said she did. I didn't see the sport seats, but she said she ordered every option. It has two tops. It's got the body-colored fiberglass top and the clear top. This was her prized possession. It was never left outside. It was always serviced at the dealer. It was never dirty. Nobody ever drove it except her. She wouldn't even let her husband drive it. And what she told me is she would take this car out, she would go cruising, she would look for men to tease, and then when she got their attention, escape, drive off, and park the car in the garage and go back to her husband. So that's what she used the car for. And anyway, it seemed to be effective. So the car has been regularly driven. It hasn't been mothballed, and it's had the benefit of annual services from GM dealers. It's only been driven about less than 3,000 kilometers in the last 10 years, but it's been driven a little bit every year, like maybe a tank of gas. Okay. The car has all of its original finishes. It's never had any paintwork. It's never had a scratch. It barely has even a rock chip. She told me that somebody in a Volkswagen van opened a door and chipped her mirror, and she had the mirror repainted for $300. That's the only part of the car that has had any paint. It has a few, you know, there's one chip there. There's a couple of minor pits in it. They haven't been touched up. I haven't made, we washed the car, cryoblasted the car, and polished the car, but I didn't try to blow in paint or recoat anything, or even touch up the stone chips. So I've never even got touch-up paint for the car. This is how I found it in her garage. The nose, which is pretty vulnerable, is still in excellent shape. You can see a little bit of scuffing on the bottom of the spoiler, and you get a better view of that from underneath the car, which is later in the video. There are no door dings in the car. There's no scratches in the car. There's no crazing of the bumpers. There's no dents in the bumper. There are a few minor pits in the windshield. It wears its original glass. All four wheels are uncurbed although 3 of them have a little bit of oxidation beneath the clear. I didn't try to refinish those, but you could strip the clear off and polish them and re-clear. So we do see that on a few of the wheels, all in the same place. The tires are 10 years old, but look brand new. And there's no age cracking, and they're still round. There's no flat spots in the tire. The car was serviced in July 2022 with a new battery and an oil change, and that's all the car has needed. It's never had any invasive maintenance. All that's been done to the car are basically oil changes and batteries. It's been a reliable car. All the instruments work correctly. The LED displays work correctly. I know they can. Some of them can burn out over time. That isn't the case with this car. So summing up the exterior, it's pretty hard to fault. Almost, I would go as far as to say impossible to reasonably fault. The car looks like it's a couple years old. I don't think the paint has been excessively polished. We polished it, maybe for the first time. So it's not like the paint is getting thin, and there's virtually no marks on the car. Except on extremely close examination, you pick up a few small chips. There's virtually perfect condition throughout, okay? Going in the car, it had this diamond coat from the factory. It hasn't never been left outside. The dash is perfectly flat with no warping and no cracking. There is no wear on any part of the center console from rings or scratches for watches, etc. There's no marks on the steering wheel from rings. There is no wear on the carpets. There's no wear on the seats. The bolsters have never been painted. That's the original finish on a leather. There's absolutely nothing to fault in the interior. It looks brand new. Even if we look at the pedals, the dead pedal, the carpets, you know, if I'm searching for a fault, it looks like this piece here should fit under that little bit of carpet. Okay, so there's that. There's no marks, there's no sticky buttons. There's nothing. It's, you know, I mean, if you said the car had 500 kilometers on it instead of 35,000, you know, it could pass for that, okay? Let's go look under the bonnet. Okay, so it's very clean under here. We did cryoblast it. It didn't look that different when we did. There's a little bit of residue from polish, which we should get out. But if you look down in there, it looks very, very, very clean. There is some very light, evidence of some oil which misted and collected the dirt. Okay, so if you look down in the center of the V, you can see a little bit of that. There's no leaks from the valve covers. You know, the exhaust still looks good. You know, those are aluminum suspension pieces. The original yellow shocks, And particularly what's interesting about this car is just the fasteners, which all look, you know, they're just unrusted. The fasteners all look just brand new on this car, even underneath. And again, we'll have it at a different part of the video, you can see underneath the car. Okay, so tuned port injection, 245 horsepower, 300 pound-feet of torque. We can look in the hinges, down in there. And this is, well, this is one of the cleanest 1980s cars I've ever seen in 20 years. You know, it was a treasured, it was a treasured item. It really was. I mean, this car meant a lot to the woman who owned it, and you know, it really was her prized possession, more than just a car. And you know, it was, women in senior positions in the auto industry in Western Canada were pretty rare in the 80s and 90s, and so, you know, she really wasn't. She's quite a forceful personality and no shrinking violet, and she knew everything about the car and could talk about gear ratios and horsepower and torque and 0 to 60 and so on, and wasn't about to defer to the men on any subject to do with automobiles. So she really got into the car and made sure she understood everything about it. And that carried through to, you know, the servicing. For instance, she never pressure washed the engine because she didn't want to have any standing water in it, and you can see that by the condition. So you know, she really was fastidious when it came to maintaining the car and you know, insisting, you know, that it got special care at the dealer. Okay. So we can, what else can we show you here? Fuel filler. And we can, oops, that's that. It comes with a gas slip from 1989 when gas was 50 cents a liter. And then we can see the body colored top in the back. All the electrical accessories work. The air conditioning blows cold. The car mechanically has no issues. It's been freshly serviced. Every switch works. There's nothing in the car that it needs. There is nothing for the owner to do besides drive this car. It doesn't need anything. I don't think you could spend a dime on it. You could argue the tires are 10 years old, so you should replace them, but they drive fine. New tires might be a little bit quieter or a little bit grippier, but there's no issues. I'm trying to get you a date code on these. And what would that be? Yeah, that'd be 2011. I think the 45th week of 2011. So the tires are about 10 years old, 11 years old. But again, I don't think I'd change them, although you could. So that's it. So in summary, inside and out, we'll get to underneath. Normally this section of the video I do a paint meter report, but that's not going to do you much good with a GRP body. But it is all original paint. I can attest to that, apart from one mirror. We still have all the original, you can see all the original rivets, and you know, of course, this car is at the lug nuts facility and is available for inspections. I know Corvette guys are really picky. They made a lot of them, so you can afford to be picky, and certainly we welcome any inspection on this car. We'll put it on the hoist for you. You go through the thing with a fine-tooth comb if you want to. It's basically as close to perfect as any reasonable person could expect a 35,000 kilometer car to be. Okay, so with that, let's go take a look underneath the car and see what's there. So let's have a look at the undercarriage of this 1988 Corvette. We've just used our fancy cryoblaster on it, and as well as a pressure washer. It was pretty clean to begin with, but let's go see what it looks like now. The suspension came out really nice. It was covered in grease from somebody like really putting a lot of grease into these ball joint nipples, and so I think that made a terrific mess, but it really actually protected the finish on the components really well. So I think it took me about 3 times as long to clean up the mess than actually do the cryoblasting, but you can see that looks pretty nice. I mean, I don't know what it would have looked like when it was new, but I don't think much different than that. We can get a good look at the spoiler, and we can see that got a little bit marked up here on something. I think the lady who I bought it from said that a tow truck driver was sloppy when he put it on his flat deck, and I think that's what he did. This piece is pretty well preserved, and you know, you can see a little bit of marks on it, but you'd expect that. And you know, most of these sports cars, you know, have got chewed up and broken front spoilers. This one doesn't. And again, the suspension came out really nice. Wheel wells look pristine, and there's just a little bit of surface rust just from the wash. And let's go underneath here and have a look. For 30 years old, I really don't know what more you could expect. There's no leaks. It's completely dry underneath. And it's fairly obvious that you know, the car hasn't been driven in bad weather. It really was a treasured possession of the lady. I did see this. Of course, that's where you're supposed to jack it up, and that's where somebody jacked it up. So they dented this steel rib, unfortunately. That's what it should look like. That's what it looks like now. But you know, after 30 years, some things are going to happen to it. That's why you want to take your car to lug nuts and do the servicing yourself. That way you make sure you jack it up in the right place. Cryoblaster really does a nice job. The only thing, it took off a little bit of the black paint there. That was the only thing that was disturbed. Even the stickers were still intact. We even got like overspray, factory overspray that's still intact. No modifications whatsoever to this car. Completely original except for the tires. And I'll show you the backs of the rims here. So I'll clean up the remaining little bits there, but the rims are all undamaged and uncurved, and we'll clean that up a little bit more before I put them back on. Okay, so that's the undercarriage of the 1988 Corvette. I guess I could show you the sills and they're undamaged. A little bit of tar that we didn't get when we washed it, so we'll address that as well. I don't really know how you'd find a better one. It's one of the nicest 80s cars I've ever seen of any manufacturer. Okay, so we'll start the driving video of the 1988 Chevrolet Corvette Coupe, so I'm on the eastern side of the city. I'm going to go through traffic. I'll wind up on the west side. We'll take a semi-spirited run through a couple of my favorite roads there. I'll narrate through the driving video, which you may or may not be interested in. So what I'll do is I'll start off just by going through all of the controls, and just so if you're only interested in, does everything work, then I'll go through that right now, and then I'll continue with the drive, and I'll go through my impressions of the car. Growing up in the 80s, when guys I knew had these cars, I've owned, from this era, the Mercedes and the Ferraris and the Porsche and so forth, all of the cars, the sports cars of that era, so I can do some, maybe some meaningful comparisons, because I've owned and driven the cars quite extensively. This is my first Corvette, and I haven't really been a Corvette guy. But that said, I've really come to appreciate the car, maybe in a way that I didn't when it was new. So, in period, I'd read all the, magazine road tests and so on, and there'd be the, the Corvette versus the Porsche versus the Ferrari versus the Jag or the Mercedes or whatever it was. And I always wanted the Porsche to win. And but the Corvette did have this habit of coming up with better numbers all the time, which was kind of annoying. But anyway, I'll shed some light on that. And after reading about these cars and being there, being aware of the car when it was introduced and so on, just in the mists of time, how does the car compare to what I thought of it then? And as a classic car purchase, how does it compare today? As opposed to when the car was brand new. Okay, but first of all, let's go through all the controls. It's a 30-degree day out, and the AC is blowing cold. Okay, so the AC does work. These LED instruments, they can be difficult to repair, and then bulbs or whatever is behind their liquid crystal displays or whatever, they burn out. They can burn out, and so for this one though, it's completely fresh and bright through all of the instrument displays. The vehicle service center is in this screen, and if there was a check engine light or whatever, it would come up here. The sound system works
building Calgary
perfectly. The sound is good. There's no issues there. The climate control also works. I can get it to cool down or warm up. Okay, so I put the climate control on automatic, and I can toggle for the electric. Here's the electric screen in the back, the front defrost, and bi-level air conditioning, etc. We've got the cool and the warm, which works. AC blows cold. I haven't tried the cassette, but presumably it works. The rest of the radio and controls work fine. We've got an interesting readout here, so we can switch from oil pressure to oil temperature, and I've got 460 kilopascals, which I think is, I can't remember the ratio, but it's the conversion to PSI, but I think it's around 50 PSI. Have to check that. But I can go to oil temperature as well, 71 degrees Celsius. So we'll keep it on oil pressure. The coolant temperature is 86 degrees Celsius.
I can change that to volts. It's 13.2 volts. Keep it on coolant temperature. The trip odometer, I can go to range. It's giving me 251 kilometers. I've gone 146 kilometers on this trip. I have an average of 14.6 liters per 100 kilometers. And that's about what, you know, I've got a bunch of other Mercedes cars, and they're all Range Rovers, and, you know, a V8 car is always seems to sit around 14, 15 for the driving that I do. So that is normal, okay? The idle is smooth, between 600 and 700 RPM. I've got the lights, I don't know if you can see them, but they pop up properly without hesitation, and they're both even. I have a button for driving lights, which also works. I'll maybe demonstrate that when it's dark. And I have the mileage. It's the normal mileage counter. It's now at 33,901 kilometers. That's around 21,000 miles. I have a Whistler 500 radar detector that was in the car new, and it does work. Cruise control, I haven't actually tried it. I'll try it on this trip. Tilt steering works. Horn works. The washers are in a bit of a strange place on the door, but if I push them, the wipers do work. And the car hasn't seen a lot of rain at all, and so those wipers, actually, the wiper blades could probably be changed. I have no idea how old they are. The central locking works, and well, and the interior lights come on when the doors are open. Okay, so everything in the interior that I can see works. The car has never been smoked in. That's completely clean. We've got a ratchet. This is for removing the roof, the hardtop. I've got the tool for the center of the wheel nuts, or the wheels. I've got a ratchet for the battery in here, and I've got a couple other assorted new trim parts. Actually, I don't know where those go. There's a gas receipt from 1991 at 56 cents a gallon, or a liter. $36 to fill the car. Okay, so that's everything in the inside of the car. The commute across the city is not much fun, so I'll just get that done, and I'll reconvene the driving video when we have some decent roads. So we're just approaching the western edge of the city. We have a little bit more stop and go to get through before we get out to some nice twisty roads. But I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the car, and you know, the points or the discussion that I could have would be, you know, on a strictly practical note, if you were to purchase this car, what are the maintenance items and the care and feeding that you could reasonably be expected to do? And, you know, when the car arrives off the transporter and you send it to the you know, you get your inspection to get it titled, and the mechanic goes over the car, you know, what's he going to say? And then if you're the next caretaker of this car, in terms of preventative maintenance and so far, what things might you address? You know, how much would it cost, etc. So anytime you buy an older car, those are obviously the questions that you have. So I'll address those. Another question might be, well, you know, how does this 1980s Corvette, you know, compare to others 1980s machinery There's a the Porsche 911 or Jaguar XJS and Ferrari 328, etc. And I have actually owned all those cars, and so I can kind of comment on that. And then as a collector car, where does its value fall relative to those, and what's likely to happen in terms of the value of the car over the next little while. So that's kind of an interesting thing to talk about. If you're looking at an old Corvette, then you have to decide which version to get, and is it a C3 or whatever, C1 through C8, and I won't go into the differences between all of those cars, and I'm not a Corvette expert, but if you were looking at for instance 80s and 90s Corvettes, which span the C4 and C5, what are the differences between those, and the design of those? How does it differ? So that's an interesting conversation. And what I think is really quite interesting about the C4 is it was a radical departure in philosophy and in materials and in construction and design from the C3, and I think that in time the C4 Corvette will, it set the design sort of language and mechanical layout and so on, for the next 20 or 30 years for the Corvette, and I guess until the recent C8 mid-engine car. But anything from 1984 to 2020 or whatever was a result of the GM's initial design in the early 80s. Okay, so I think that is also an interesting conversation. But let's starting with practical, and then maybe deviating into a longer discussion. We've already seen. First of all, if you presumably you've looked at the photographs of the car on the ground and on the hoist and so on, and there can be no doubt that this is a very nice car and very well preserved. Okay, there's not a mark on the car, virtually inside, outside, underneath, whatever. This car has been loved and cherished since the day it was born. Later in the video, you can take a look at the maintenance receipts, and I just compiled those. I built a spreadsheet, showing the frequency of the maintenance and so on, what was done when. The car has had 26 oil changes in 34 years. The average mileage per oil change is a little over 1,300 kilometers per oil change. Well, that means that it's been given an oil change, one oil change for every 3 tanks of gas. So then there's nothing wrong with the car. All the switches work, all the controls work properly, it drives fine, there's no funny noises, it operates as a new or few-year-old car, and there's a couple minor points I can make on the maintenance, but really it's close to a new 1988 Corvette as you're likely to find, and it doesn't have any meaningful flaws, and the car is pretty much impossible to reasonably fault. Like nobody would come and look at this car, come for a drive in this car, and not be impressed with its condition and the way it drives. All right, so just get that out of the way. That all said, I looked through all the maintenance, and certainly the people in the dealership told the lady who owned it to change the oil frequently, and she did. We have a coolant flush in 2020. We have batteries every 2 years when the car wasn't driven. The one thing I didn't see is a brake fluid flush, and although it's been checked once or twice a year every year since it was born, I don't see a receipt saying that it had new brake fluid. Now, some of the maintenance history, some of the maintenance records could have been lost, but I don't know when the brake fluid was last flushed. I did talk to the first owner of the car, and she confirmed that it has the original brakes on it, so it's never had brakes, which is pretty unusual for 33,000 kilometers. But obviously she didn't drive the car very hard. If you look at the photographs, you can see there is some surface rust, not on the surface of the rotor, but on the the top of the rotor and the edges. So, if I bought this car, I'd probably treat it to a brake flush and probably buy new rotors. I can't imagine they're very expensive. Also, the car stops fine. There's no issues with it stopping, but the initial bite of the, I don't have another Corvette to compare it to, but it seems to me the initial bite of the brakes could be a little bit more aggressive. When I detailed the car, the wheel wells and suspension was covered in grease. The shocks were covered in grease, the inside of the wheels was covered in grease, and what I found when I got in there and took the wheels off is that I was taking out big handfuls, or at least fingerfuls, of grease from the ball joints. The chassis was lubricated, and they must have had I don't know what they're using at the dealership, but maybe something for a tank or something like that, because there was a lot of excess grease. I cleaned it all up. I made a huge mess. Cleaned the inside of the wheels out, cleaned everything up so it looks pretty. But I think because the inside of the wheels was covered in grease, probably some got on the rotor too. Probably the pads are a little bit contaminated. So I'd get rid of the pads and change the rotor. So that is something that I do for the car. Obviously you don't need to change the oil. It was just done a few hundred kilometers ago. The coolant was done in 2020. So I wouldn't do anything there. The transmission, it got a flush. I'd have to go look at the records, not for quite a while ago, maybe 10 years ago. So you could flush the transmission fluid. From memory, I think it was done at around 20,000 kilometers. So that could be done. I didn't see any record of the spark plugs ever being spark plugs, rotor, distributor, spark plug wires. I didn't see any record of any of that ever been done to the car. So you could probably do that. Drivability of the car is excellent. There is on a cold start, it has stalled a few times, and it's taken a few starts to get it going. Once it's going, it's fine. But there is something in the cold start mechanism, enrichment mechanism in the fuel injection, isn't working as new. You should just fire it once, and it should idle steadily. But the few times I've tried it when it's cold, it doesn't do that. Now, this car is like gas in it from, I don't know, maybe 2 years old. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm putting, running a full tank of fuel through the car. And as I've been driving the car, it hasn't stalled. So I think what's going to happen is I'm going to go through I go through a tank of gas, and it'll go away. However, the possibility remains that whatever the mechanism is, cold start injector or whatever, could need some attention, either cleaning it out or a replacement of that part. I don't know that for sure, but chances are I'm not going to do anything until I run fresh gas through the car, and that's what I'm doing now. Okay, so we've got a twisty road here, and I'll put the gearbox in second gear, and we can see how it handles. The tires are 11 years old. I think they have a date stamp of 2011. There's no vibration. Maybe new tires would be a little bit quieter. I don't know. But there's no cracking they were stored in a climate-controlled garage, so there's no degradation of the tires that I can notice. However, they are 11 years old. Oops, bird. Oh, we missed the bird, everybody. So yeah, and the brakes, if I jam on the brakes, you know what? No, the brakes should be more aggressive than that. hadn't done that before. So I'll call the car for new rotors and pads. The car should brake harder than that. Let me just try that again. And we'll jam on the brakes. No, the pedal effort's too high for that deceleration. So I think I would confirm what I originally thought about the brakes on the car. And so I'll be slightly careful. There's cyclists on this road. And the brakes work fine. I mean, not a safety issue. They slow the car down, but it should be more aggressive than that. Handling of the car is quite lovely. You know, there's no creaks or groans or whines or any noises from the suspension. Obviously, you know, you expect this car to handle to corner fairly flat, and it does. These cars were criticized in period because maybe the suspension was too firm. Certainly on the first Z51 suspension package. This one doesn't have that package. It's a few years older. Isn't the Z52 package, which gives you the 17-inch wheels and upgraded shocks, and I think a lower axle ratio as well, actually. But the engine pulls well. Certainly enough performance for this road, and the handling is nice. You can tell it's a fast car, and why, you know, Corvette's made such great race cars with, you know, fat rubber, wide track, low center of gravity. I think I mean, I have a theory maybe that the stiff suspension and the criticism that the car got was probably because this design doesn't allow for a lot of suspension travel. You know, it's a fairly low car and low bonnet line, and I think that to get the car to work properly, the suspension does need to be stiff. Otherwise, you'd be bottoming it out because there's just not a lot of travel there. I know with the Porsche 911s, and particularly the Jaguar, you know, there's a lot more travel in the suspension, so it'll accommodate a much larger upset in the road and still feel composed. This one gets disturbed over, you know, larger bumps, which is what they said when the car was new. Okay, but on a smooth road, my goodness, you know, the limits are, you know, sky high. Okay, so comparing it to, okay, so that for the maintenance, let's just keep on track here. For the maintenance, if I bought the car, I would give it a brake job. I would change the fluid. I would change the rotors and pads. I'd do that. I'd keep an eye on the cold start injector. I may very well if it was my car, I'd run a few tanks of gas through it before I did anything. But there's a possibility that, you know, maybe I think this car has a cold start injector that might need to be changed out. I may take the opportunity to just do plugs, wires, distributor, the basic tune-up items, because it's 35 years. Might as well just do it, and, you know, the parts aren't cheap, or the parts aren't expensive. Okay, so with that, you know, we did a good job of cryoblasting and pressure washing the bottom of the car. It looks brand new. Part of the reason I think that the suspension looks so good is because it was covered with grease. So that was what used as a preservative. So I might go back there and just take a grease wax solution, whatever it is, WD-40 would even work, and recoat those items. They'll get dirty because they'll attract the dirt when you do that. But I think I'd probably recoat all the fasteners and so on the underneath of the car. So I'd probably do that. We gave the car a two-stage polish, not very aggressive, just because I didn't want to take any more paint off than I needed to. So you could go a little bit further with the polishing, and if you did that, you might want to give it one of these new ceramic coatings, which I haven't used before, but you know, they seem to be quite effective. You know, basically think of those as a long life wax. The interior, the leather's been conditioned every year. It's in beautiful shape. It was last done last year, but you could recondition the upholstery. It has its original, just the original carpet mats. There were no floor mats, extra floor mats, and so, you know, the woman, you know, this car never got dirty. Even when it was serviced at the dealership, she always insisted it was kept inside. But you know, you might as well put those in just to preserve the original carpet mats. And I'm sure, you know, you could get, I usually get cocoa mats for my 80s cars, and so you could get a black and red cocoa mat that would look nice on that. There's a bunch of companies online, so I'd probably do that. The air filters have been changed, but you might as well put new ones in while you're at it. Everything appears to be lubricated properly, so I don't think there's any issues there. You know, you might decide to give it another transmission service. So, you know, give the car a major service and a brake job. I think I would just do that if it was my car. And that is about it. That is about it. There's nothing really this car needs. The tires are fine. I wouldn't buy new tires. They're quiet. There's no flat spots. There's no age cracking. But you know, if you want to find, they might be you might get a little bit quieter cabin noise. Sometimes new tires do that, and you know, you might get some more grip if that's important to you. All right. So that is what I would do, or I would advise the new owner of this car to do when they buy it. That's what I would do if I was going to keep the car. And we have a stop sign and the opportunity to run up through the gears. All right, let's cross this intersection. Fast car. But I'm not going to push it. Okay, so let's say you've assessed the various merits of these 80s cars, the Porsche and the Corvette and the Ferrari and the Mercedes and the Jaguar, and you come to the conclusion that you know, the Corvette was the best value then, and now it's even more so. Okay, so you know, at you know, 2/3 the price of a Porsche, it was terrific value. Well, now it's 1/5 the price of a Porsche. Okay, so there's no question about it. It's a terrific value, not just in terms of the purchase price, but also the maintenance and the livability as well. So it's a very practical car. It's happy just to, you can use it as a personal commuter if you want to. AC works good. It's not a fussy car. You know, it's happily idling in traffic and so forth. What about, you know, which Corvette do you want then? You know, we have the C4 that came out in '83. It got a redesign in '89. It became the C5 in '97, I think. You know, what were the differences between the cars, and where do you want to buy in that spectrum? Well, you know, for sure in 1984, you know, the car's focus was on handling and dynamics and design and aerodynamics, not on outright performance. In the early 80s, you know, it simply was very difficult to get that done. So in '84, the car came out with only 205 horsepower. A Ferrari 308 had the same, actually. The 308 GTSI, I think, was 205 horsepower. The 911 SC was, you know, I think it was 211, and then, you know, maybe 218 or something like that, around there anywhere, from the 3-liter, and then the 3.2 Carrera, which came out in '84, same year as this, would have had 232 horsepower. This was 245. Okay, so now, you know, the base 911 has like 380. You know, the base Corvette, oh, it must be 400. I don't even know right now, 400 or 500 horsepower anyway, and the Ferrari's up to 600. So the performance and the horsepower, what they've been able to get out of the engines with the advances in electronic controls, have allowed a drastic increase in power. You know, this car is merely fast enough and quick, but you know, you can get a 500 horsepower Z06, which is, you know, terrifyingly fast. Okay, so throughout the 80s and 90s, the cars grew more powerful. Whether you can use that power on the road's a different story, and of course the values of the cars go up, you know, basically with the horsepowers. So that leaves the 80s Corvettes being, you know, the real value. You know, the first one had 205 horsepower and kind of a goofy manual transmission, 4-speed with three overdrives, the Doug Nash, and nobody seemed to like that very much. I've never even driven one, but it's not that well reviewed. This is a 4-speed automatic. The car got, I think, more power in the early 90s, and I think the C4's got all the way up to, you know, 320 horsepower or something like that. This is 245. They got a redesign for the interior in '89, and I don't consider that an advance. You know, this interior here, you know, I think is plainly, you know, styled after you know, fighter aircraft, where you've got these, you know, individual modules which would be components on an aircraft. Now it's all glass screen, but back then, you know, you just had the individual components. So I think the Corvette is kind of, you know, like a fighter pilot's kind of car. All right, so this driving video is coming to an end. Hopefully it wasn't too boring for you. But in short, I think this C4 has a lot to recommend it. It's the original design, the original interior, not the restyled 1989. The power is up with the tuned port injection, up to 245 horsepower, up 40 horsepower from the original one. So it is the most powerful C4 you can get with the original interior and the original design, and I think that appeals to me. This particular example, well, you're just not going to find a nicer one. I mean, even if you did find a no mileage C4 Corvette, you know, it would be very, very unlikely that it would have the maintenance history of this car. So I think it you know, probably has the perfect amount of mileage, enough to run the car 300 or 400 or 500 kilometers per year. It got its annual service, enough to keep everything lubricated. You know, a no mileage car is just going to be mothballed and can present all kinds of problems, you know, when you try to put it on the road. Not to mention, when you pay a big premium for a no mileage car and then drive it, you erase the premium that you just paid for. So it's got low kilometers at 33,967 now, but not so low that you can't drive the car. Okay, so if this has, you know, 21,000 miles on it now, if you put a few thousand miles on it, it's not going to hurt the value, and you can enjoy the car. So the combination of a good year and an exceptionally well preserved car, I think makes this a rare find. I wouldn't be able to find another one like this. In 20 years of selling cars, I've never seen a car get one oil change for every 3 tanks of gas and still be, you know, used regularly. I've had cars but that didn't get driven, but they didn't get maintained either. I've never seen a car this low mileage with this kind of maintenance history. Okay, so with that, I'll leave it at that. Lromanosky from Calgary, Canada, 1988 Corvette Coupe, and a lot of fun, and, you know, a great car. I hope the next custodian lavishes as much care and attention and love as the first woman owner, who it was a really special thing for. Okay, Lromanosky from Calgary. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.